This episode of Main Street Moxie is proudly sponsored by Northeast Ford and Elise Harney Real Estate.
Hey, Mary, what's going on?
Not much. Super excited about this guest.
Someone you've known for quite a while, and I've had the honor of knowing for a few years.
Yeah, so Sarah Getz, I have known as my yoga instructor. She's not just mine, but
She's not your private?
She's not my private, but I go to Sarah's classes whenever I can. And her father is Arthur Kimmig Getz, who was a prolific New Yorker magazine cover artist as well as a fine artist. And I've gotten to know a bit more about Sarah and her dad, and I thought she would make a great Moxie by Proxy episode talking about his work as an artist and then segueing into intergenerational Moxie and the lessons she learned. Yeah. So I think people are really going to enjoy learning about Sarah herself. She's a accomplished yoga instructor. Maybe that's not how we should look at yoga instructors, but she's done a lot with yoga, and she's very, very intentional and serious about it, and also playful about it. And she's also a writer, and she dedicates herself to that as much as she can. And so I just find her to be a fascinating person and a wonderful human being, and I'm super excited to listen to what she has to say.
Awesome. Well, hey, how about we just dive in?
Let's do it.
All right.
Elise Harney Real Estate is the #1 real estate agency for the tri-state region, and they provide a comprehensive overview of the regional market spanning Litchfield, Dutchess, Columbia, and Berkshire counties.
Elise Harney Real Estate serves 40 unique communities with 35 years of experience. They have a team of knowledgeable real estate professionals to work with you to buy or sell your house.
Their offices are located in Salisbury, Millerton, Norfolk, Falls Village, and Riverton, or you can visit them online at www.harneyrealestate.com.
So we're here today with Sarah Getz for this Main Street Moxie episode, which is a Moxie by Proxy conversation about her dad, artist Arthur Kimmig Getz. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Mary. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we thought we would spend some time talking about your dad's Moxie, and then we would segue into whatever Moxie you've inherited from him or developed on your own, because you are a successful yoga instructor with a long-time yoga studio in Lakeville, Connecticut, and that requires Moxie as well. So we're going to investigate your brand of what I'm calling intentional Moxie.
Great. Well, I love the term an inherited Moxie. I don't think I've ever heard that before.
Well, so we're going to ask you first off what you think your dad would have defined Moxie as and where you might have seen it exhibited in his life.
That's a great question, and I do know, being his daughter, that my dad was one of the most determined, stubborn people I have ever met, and I know I've inherited a wee bit of that myself. And he came from a background which was not an artistic background. His family was low income. His father was a factory worker, and he had to get his high school art teacher to come to his house and convince his parents to let him to go to Pratt Institute.
Wow.
So from the get-go, he had some support, but he also had a great deal of determination to become an artist, go to art school. And then he lived in great poverty for many years in New York City trying to scrap together a living. And I think that all of that is evidence of what you could call Moxie for an artist, not giving up.
Right, right. And he is most famous for his 213 New Yorker covers.
You got it.
So, which you have an Instagram account devoted to.
I do.
So people can find that in our show notes. But so at an early age, he knew it was art.
He knew, and there's actually a wonderful story he tells in an interview that I think in first grade or second grade, he was placed in school next to a young Chinese American boy who did ink brush drawing. And my dad would sit and watch him and became fantastically jealous of this boy's skill. And actually, ink brush drawing is something that he did at a certain point. But he then began to draw himself, and there were really no artists in the family. But he also joked that he never saw an original oil painting until he went to Pratt Institute. He never went to a museum. He just had a natural interest in drawing and painting, and that's what happened. He got lucky.
Was he self-taught then completely during that time, or?
I think he was. Now, his father was a clerk at this is an alliteration issue, the Patterson Parchment Paper Company. And one of the things his father was responsible for doing is things like butter wrappers and drawing little cows and clover. And my dad, when he was very young, this I think was during the high school era, worked summers there and began doing little drawings and graphic design. Of course, this is way before photography, so any advertisement, anything that was packaging was drawn.
Right.
So he had this very pragmatic side of him, obviously, because he grew up in a working class family. How did he manage to keep his artistic vision alive while also having the pragmatic background of working class work ethic?
That's a great question, and I think that it would be answered by my father's personality. He was a very gruffly spoken, frugal, practical, liberal person. He was very well versed in artists. He knew a lot about art history. He knew a lot about dance because of his first wife, who was a former ballerina. But he also was a very kind of down-home, plain-spoken guy. So he never was of the ilk of a society artist, a social butterfly. He never got into the drinking scene, which was a big part, unfortunately, of some of those early abstract artists in New York City. He was a very kind of grounded artist. And he had a rigorous work ethic. And even as a little girl, and I was trying to remember how we navigated this, whether it was something he told me or something I intuitively picked up. But even as a little girl, when I was in his studio, I knew not to bother him when he was painting. And it was sort of fascinating to be in his presence because he would focus for hours standing in front of an easel. He would whistle between his teeth. And he wore these big, thick glasses. So he sort of had these glazed over eyes, which of course were his glasses. But he had this sort of contemplative focus that I was very impressed by and respectful of. My father was a very kind man. It wasn't like I couldn't interrupt him, but when he was in process, I would just go off and do my own thing. I knew to leave him alone.
I think today they call that flow.
Yes, they do.
Where you're completely wrapped up in an activity and one with it. What was that like to observe that in a parent? My dad was a CPA, and he got his flow from numbers, but he did all his work at work. What was it like to observe that level of effort and concentration? Did it rub off on you?
I think it was a real education for me, and I would also give my mother some credit as well because she was a writer and a poet for most of her life. I think that I got to observe his process both literally in the studio in front of his easel, but also the fact that as a New Yorker cover artist, I mean, he had to work to make a living, and he struggled all his life with trying to make enough to support me, etc. But he was constantly trying to think of New Yorker cover ideas. So as we walked around the world, if we went for a hike or to a grocery store, he would be looking at scenarios. And I almost could hear his brain going, click, 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 would this make a good New Yorker cover? And sometimes he would whip out a notebook and draw a quick sketch. So this was just a part of the way he was.
Right.
That being said, your mention of flow is really interesting because what he yearned for and didn't always get was the continuum of flow that fine artists will immerse themselves in, where they do a theme or a subject over many, many paintings, and they have the leisure and the time to do that. My dad had to be more of a quick change artist. He would be working very hard on one image for a New Yorker cover. Hopefully the editor would buy it, and then he'd have to completely switch gears. So it was more of a short-term flow focus that he had to achieve rather than a long-term. And he really wished for the life of a fine artist.
Which he was able to somewhat achieve in
Which
his later
he was.
years?
I mean, he was extremely versatile. He made his bread and butter, so to speak, as an illustration artist, but he also was a fine artist, and he did landscapes and he did etchings. He wrote and illustrated children's books.
For you?
Yes, including one for me. I am the star of a children's book. My alias was Jennifer. It's Jennifer's Walk, which my mother wrote and my father illustrated. You can imagine the questions this raised for me as a child.
Yeah.
You know, who was I? Yeah, so he was a very versatile guy. So he did definitely in his free time pursue other interests. But he, you know, in his early years, he had been close friends with Philip Guston and Willem de Kooning, and he watched them go on to have successful careers as fine artists, where my dad really was sort of in the position of becoming an illustration artist. And there was a bias at the time against illustration artists. They were, you know, hacks. They worked for hire. They weren't the artist in the garret fantasy that people have. So he did struggle with that in his career.
Yeah, I could see how that would be. You want something and yet you know it's just out of reach for very good reasons, but making that switch over to the full-time fine artist.
Yes.
I think that debate still, when I was in art school, we still had that debate because I was in the graphic design. We weren't considered artists by the real artist. I'm using air quotes.
Yes.
So, you know, I can recognize that still goes on today within the artist communities, that the other art kids would say to us, oh, you guys are sellouts because you're doing it, you know, you're hired to do a job.
Yeah.
Type of thing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it happens in all art fields. There's often bias. You know, cartoons are
Right.
cartoonists are judged, etc.
Yep.
In fact, one of the reasons I use the word Kimmig, the name Kimmig, in my social media about my dad is because he did a large series of paintings and signed it with the name Kimmig, because when he started to become a successful New Yorker cover artist and he was simultaneously trying to be a fine artist, the director, I think it was the Babcock Gallery in New York City, said you can't exhibit under the name Getz because you're already known as a New Yorker artist. You won't be taken seriously. You need a nom de paint, whatever it is.
Right.
So he chose his mother's maiden name, which was Kimmig, and his middle name. So there's a whole series of paintings that are just signed Kimmig, and later he went back and also signed Getz. But there's also Kimmigs out in the world, and there's people who don't necessarily trace Kimmig to Getz. So it's kind of a fascinating part of his history.
That's interesting. Huh. So he couldn't be known as both.
Yes.
What was his process with the New Yorker covers? Would they be commissioned? Would they tell him, you know, we're looking for this? Or would he come up with something and then pitch it to them? Or how did that work?
That's a great question. And it's actually, I think it's different now.
Right.
But in the old days, they did not commission artwork. Every Tuesday, the art editor would have an open meeting. I went to a couple of those, and all the artists would truck into the city and go to the New Yorker offices. And I've joked before, it was a little bit like going to a dentist's office because everybody was nervous. They had their portfolios. The room was filled with cigarette smoke. Everybody smoked like a chimney. And they would go into the art editor and plop down sketches of ideas, and the editor would leaf through them and say, nope, 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 no, we did this last year, no, you've done this before, no, this is cliche, this is maybe interesting, take it back and work on it. Very occasionally, if the idea was good enough, the artist would receive kind of like a stipend, like a living wage to keep working on it. But my dad went through, you know, there was one cover I think he did 100 versions of before the editor bought it.
Oh my gosh.
There were some cover ideas that I think are particularly brilliant that he had as executed paintings that they just never bought, or they bought and then they decided were obsolete. And then they, quote unquote, killed the covers. That's a term that you sometimes see.
Okay.
The rights reverted back to the artist. The original art came back to the artist, but they were never published. So very rarely, I think the magazine would realize, oh gosh, there's an election coming up. We don't have an election cover. And they would reach out to their cover artists and say, hurry up and try to get something in here. But in those days, it was really hit or miss. And, you know, there were times where my dad went for years without selling a cover. And there were other years in which he had 6, 7, 8, 11 published. So it was not a guaranteed thing.
That is pretty stressful.
Yeah.
For me, anyway.
It's stressful, but with my dad's personality, I mean, he once described himself as a bulldog, and I think that was a very apt description. It posed a creative challenge which he was sort of determined to meet. In fact, in one of his interviews, he very hilariously describes getting into this battle with the art editor of the New Yorker. He was determined to solve this cover, and the editor didn't like it, and he was determined to sell it. And I think my dad eventually won. But that was the personality he had, and I think that relates to your question about Moxie.
Right.
I think he had plenty of that, and it saw him through his career.
And it also says, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, was it just he had a belief in himself and in his artistry, and he was confident enough in that? Would that be part of his Moxie and how I was just thinking back to, in high school and, convincing his parents to let him to go to art school.
I think that's definitely true, and at the same time, he was an exceptionally humble person. And he was very open about other artists who did things better than him.
Okay. Yeah.
And he was also very open about, quote unquote, stealing from other artists like Hopper. He, in one interview, said how he would raid Hopper's paintings for ideas and images. And so he, I think, was confident in his determination and also acknowledging that his skills were ever evolving. He was never quite satisfied. He never rested on his laurels.
How did one of the questions we like to ask is the F word, failure. And we're trying to come up with a different name for that. But
setbacks. I wrote it down here.
You wrote it down.
I'm banging the table. Setbacks.
Okay. Thorin, then take it away.
No, go ahead. I was adding it to.
So setbacks. So it sounds like he had them in spades, just because of the people that were opining on his art, saying, no, go back to the drawing board, and his persistence of just keep coming back. Was that a lesson for you? Did he ever throw his hands up in despair that you ever saw, or he just wouldn't acknowledge failure?
I think he did acknowledge failure and disappointment, but his work ethic was such that it meant that he needed to keep going. And that was something that he would then literally do if he was frustrated with a painting, or if something didn't sell or wasn't published. He would have his moment of displeasure. He often would relieve stress by going and taking a hike on the Appalachian Trail. He was a great outdoorsman. And then he would get back to work. And it was really the work that sustained him, I think, rather than the successes. And he was never someone who wanted... It's different now with social media. It's so interesting to talk about a creative time before social media, because he didn't crave adulation, and first he didn't like going to parties. I think he talked at one point about his publishing career in children's books and how he would have liked to have done more, but he didn't really seek a forum for being praised. I think it was a very personal and internal process for him, his sense of his success. And that's something that I learned from and hope to emulate, that we can have our failures and disappointments, and if we're strong enough inside, we just keep going. It's just another learning experience.
Right. That's how we're kind of seeing it as people talk about it.
It's developing. Was it more than going to the praise from others? Was it more for him just about the work? That's what he really craved and wanted to do, and that's where he got his inner joy from?
I think so. Yeah. And I mean, he certainly did have challenges in his life. I mean, his first marriage to the ballet dancer ended, and his marriage to my mother ended. They divorced when I was 3. He had financial challenges. He had a regular human life, but I think that he was just one of these rare persons who knew himself and knew that art was his way and what he wanted to do, and he just kept at it.
Did he have inspiration from any particular sources? Or you were saying, like, you'd go to the grocery store, he was always looking for something, but did his inspiration come from any particular place, or did he seek them out?
I think with the New Yorker covers, he very much looked at the world, because if you think, I mean, I'm not an art person or an art historian myself, but if you look at what a New Yorker cover is, especially in the old days, I mean, now they tend to be more topical, right? But in the old days, it captured a moment that the viewer would recognize and say, oh, I know that. even if it was a scene that wasn't of something literal. And so my dad was constantly looking at the world and looking for those moments or those glimpses, the railroad tracks disappearing under Park Avenue, something that someone would say, yes, that's so New York, that image. He occasionally he had a collection of old National Geographics, great old National Geographics, which he would flip through. He didn't so much work from photographs, though he did use them to correct himself if he was doing something complicated. He also looked at other artists constantly, admiring what other artists who worked for illustration publications were doing, as well as some of the classical great fine artists.
Do you feel that if you were to take the New Yorker title off of his paintings, I mean, I personally would love to go to an exhibit of his work because I really enjoy the Instagram account and seeing what you're talking about, that he's capturing a life moment, seemingly mundane but elevated to something else that we can all relate to. And I was struck that he almost reminds me of a more whimsical Norman Rockwell, how Rockwell would capture those moments. And do you think there would be a chance for a re-examination and a reclassification of his work into fine art?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know the answer to that because I don't know the art world well enough. I know that in a sense my father's work went out of favor with the New Yorker. The New Yorker is an entity that goes through its own branding issues. And when Tina Brown took over the magazine, she really didn't want to use a lot of the older artists because they represented something that she did not want to represent anymore. And that's sort of understandable that an entity can change its face and rebrand. So his work went out of favor. He was trying to sell art to the magazine up into the 1980s, and it just got slimmer and slimmer until he decided he was retired.
Right.
That's how he dealt with that particular setback.
Good for him.
He was retired. I do think in looking at some of the actual paintings that they have the vivid impact of a piece of fine art, but this is such a subjective question, and it really depends on the viewer. I do know there have been efforts to honor illustration artists and look at them under a different lens than is typically done, including Rockwell, who, the social commentary is really very amazing.
Yep.
So we'll see.
And he was a magazine illustrator.
He certainly was. Saturday Evening Post.
Right.
In fact, I must say, Norman Rockwell sent 2 fan letters to my dad. I'm so proud of them. I have them, and they were so sweet. One was about a cover he did, I think, for St. Patrick's Day, and the other was a cover I don't remember. But my dad treasured them because Rockwell went through his own issues in his career of other artists dissing him for being such an illustration hack, and so my dad felt sort of buddy with him, and they had mutual respect.
Northeast Ford offers great sales and service, including a no-charge pickup and delivery for any service, even with oil changes. And they offer 2-year unlimited oil changes with any vehicle purchase, new or pre-owned.
Northeast Ford makes buying, selling, or trading in your car super easy. They have charging stations for your electric vehicle and a ready cash now offer and vehicle check on the spot if you wish to sell your vehicle. And they provide help with all the paperwork.
They service 6 counties, and they are located at 182 Route 44 in Millerton, where you can swing by and see Lan and his great sales team.
Or visit them online at www.northeastfordmillerton.com. One of the, I think it was the article in the New Yorker after your dad had passed away, and it talked about his humility and his barrel-chested physique and his Amish beard, and also his support and encouragement of younger artists. It sounded like he had this tension between the practical side of pumping out covers and trying to stay creative, and then this fine art side. How would that mentoring look? Would he try to mentor younger people to do what he did or not do what he did, or how would that have looked, do you think?
Well, my dad taught art throughout his life, and I think it started I'm guessing in the 1960s, before I was born, he started teaching at the School of Visual Arts, and then he taught at places like Washington Art Association in Washington Depot, Connecticut for over 20 years. He taught through UConn. So teaching, which was something he did to make an income, right? There was a practical financial aspect. Also met some of his needs for staying connected with people, because he was a real introvert and a real hermit. And he loved engaging with young artists. And I actually have had contact with many artists, including some who are now friends of mine, about the encouragement he gave them. And he had I think a rather unique combination of encouraging them to honor their vision and their integrity, and also be very practical, and not say quit their day job because they'd finally mastered the watercolor technique they were working. I mean, my dad was a very, again, pragmatic person, but I have gotten letters and also run into people saying, your dad said this one thing to me in the art class in 1979 that changed my life, and it's really lovely to hear. So I think it's a very tricky role that an art teacher has in dealing with young artists. I know that you've been through this around in art school.
Yeah.
How much do you encourage someone, and how much do you encourage them to have a day job and to take care of those practicalities? But I think that he must have done a beautiful job.
I imagine he did. I mean, it sounds like he would be that person to authentically engage and encourage.
Was that perhaps part of his Moxie duty, or sharing his Moxie with those students?
Yes. Yeah. I think he was very generous with his advice and his inspiration. Definitely. And that's kind of neat, because I think when we think about Moxie, we're thinking about an individual's character and their flair. But what they share with others should also be included. How much they share, what they're willing to share with others, should be a part of their Moxie too.
I agree with that. And I think, some of our guests have kind of shared the same thing. And, like Kirk Neller and a couple others have said, even Eleanor Roosevelt, part of their Moxie was their commitment to the communities and to helping the next generation. Sarah was another one. So, a lot of their Moxie personal was, in fact, what they did with others. So I was just curious to see if you thought the same with him. So how did that translate to you in your career?
In terms of what my dad taught me or offered me?
Yeah, just seeing him, his personality, his choices, his career, him as a person. How did that impact your life and your career?
Well, I think from the get-go, it seemed to me as a child that creativity was a bedrock on which you could rest your entire life. And I had that from both my dad and my mom, that whatever creative practice you had, it could weave into your life in this very effortless way. And so I was raised that way, and I grew up, drawing and a little bit, and writing and playing music, and it seemed that was sort of my birthright. Right. Not that I was particularly talented or anything, but because my parents did it, I did it too, and I'm really grateful for that. I also think my mom's side of the family are Quaker, and part of Quaker beliefs is community service. And I think that in addition to my creative pursuits, I was brought up, and I also went to a Quaker school, that with the idea that you need to give something back, whether it's a little thing or something to the environment or something to the people, that should also be part of a human life. And that is something that I guess I don't even really question, that it's just something you do, kind of community service. And so I think that has to some extent informed my yoga teaching, which I kind of fell into almost by accident because friends of mine were doing it. And I made fun of them terribly. I mean, back then, yoga was something you made fun of. It was something your grandmother did,
My grandmother never did yoga.
Well, my grandmother didn't either. But I ended up feeling that, people were kinder to themselves and others and the world around them when they'd had a little practice in their bodies. And wasn't this a really important thing in the world as is? And that just has sort of informed me since then.
Around what time was that?
I started practicing in the 1990s. Let's see. When I was still in New York City, I went to high school and college in New York City. I went to the New School. And then I was in a rock band. I mean, you don't know this about me, but loud electric guitar is one of my great passions. And so I was progressively going deaf and playing in a rock band and actually working for a homelessness prevention agency on the Lower East Side. But friends of mine were starting to go to this crazy, neat studio called Jiva Mukti, where everyone wore black eyeliner and they played U2 in class or Van Morrison. And I was like, this sounds really nutty.
Yeah.
So I was dragged to my first class and I just fell in love with it. And it came at a time for me where I was really questioning how much I wanted to be a performer. So these were the days, I mean, I had like Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth, but I didn't have a lot of examples in the rock world of women who I really could emulate comfortably. And I didn't love being up on stage. I'm more of an introverted person. So I sort of simultaneously fell in love with yoga and realized that teaching it was something that I sort of wanted to do organically. And then I very briefly moved to California, and then the unfortunate happened, which is my father died. So that's why I was bounced back here.
You're also a writer.
Yes.
And I will say that when I first read where you did some graduate work at the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poets, is what I thought it said, but it's poetics.
It's poetics. And yes, you have to say that 10 times fast or it doesn't mean anything.
So I was trying to imagine a disembodied poet, but now I don't have to do that anymore. How does your writing weave in? I mean, I've taken a bunch of classes with you over the years, and you've been in practice for 20 years, which is your own testament to hard work.
Wait, writing or yoga?
Yoga.
Okay.
You've been doing yoga at Space since 2012?
No, actually, we started in 2002.
Right, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
Sorry. So it's 20 years.
Yeah, and I got my first yoga teaching certification in 1994.
Wow.
So I'm feeling really old right now. But yeah.
But the longevity of your practice, the COVID pivot, your loyal following, that is your own persistence and growth that I think models your father's. And then you have this writing piece, which you sometimes refer to in yoga class, but what is that to you?
So I think as a child, I had, the dual loves of music and writing. And music performance was something that I really chose not to pursue. But writing, which of course would appeal to an introvert far more, really became a strong part of my life, even when I was very, very young. In fact, one of my first memories of my dad's studio is me trying to make a little book by folding pieces of paper in half, and then I tried to scotch tape a binding and it didn't work, and I was crying in frustration, so he let me use his staple gun.
Oh.
My dad was a great guy in some ways. But writing was a way for me to both learn about myself through journaling and then through the kind of writing I learned through Natalie Goldberg. I studied with her extensively. And then I fell in love with fantasy, grounded fantasy, what some people would call speculative fiction. And that's my focus now and is something that I pursue. I had a literary agent for a time, and then she left the industry. So I've kind of, my first novel got stranded, and I've now written other things, and I'm looking for another agent. But it's something that is definitely something I love and I'm passionate about. And I often will say that yoga has my back as like an energetic support, but writing has my heart.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
So what does your day look like? Like, do you sit and
Oh,
write
God, Mary,
every
don't
day?
ask.
I know you take pictures of your cats for Instagram, but what do you have that flow time like your dad had, where your cats are outside saying, "I can't disturb Sarah right now"?
I don't right now because, the world is complicated.
Yeah.
I'm also working part-time for my husband, for his business. He has a small solar company. I have become kind of what I call a kamikaze creative person, which is if I have an hour, I do something.
And you dive
I don't
in.
always have an hour. So I don't have a regular schedule right now. And, all of us have been in upheaval for so many reasons over the past couple of years, and many of us don't have set schedules. And I'm really trying to make peace with it. And I think that some of us have a preconception that an artist needs the 8-hour day alone in their studio. And, my dad had that. He wasn't actively raising a child because my parents had separated by then. So he did have the privilege of being alone in his studio and working all day. Many of us don't have that privilege. I think it's a little bit of a problem if we think we need that in order to create. And I think we can take the time that we have and learn to be nimble and learn to be supple in what we do and what we call creative work, and still get a lot of satisfaction out of it. So that's what I try to do with my writing. If I have a snippet of time, if I have a project I'm pursuing, I just tuck it in where I can.
That's great advice, because I feel that's what your father also, this was the point that I was thinking of before, is that when I read things about people's creative process, a lot of it is just slogging away, putting in the half hour a day or 500 words or whatever it is every day, whether you feel like it or not.
Absolutely. And caffeine.
Yes, yes.
Don't forget caffeine.
And unsweetened chocolate.
And yes, you read my bio.
I do my homework. When people send me things to read, I have to read them. So, yeah, and you're also a tree hugger.
I am a tree hugger.
How does that manifest itself?
Well, my husband has a solar installation company. We chose to be childless. We're sort of environmentally aware people, or try to be. I do think that is one of the most pressing issues of our time. So while I don't live a perfect life, that is something that is in my thoughts and relates very much to the yoga concept of ahimsa, which means non-harming or non-violence, which people often take about their relationship with themselves and other people, but I think we must expand to our relationship with the entire planet, or we're in trouble. So I do hug trees. I love trees. I have some of my favorite trees. I hike to them. I mean, I like my dad, I do spend a lot of time outside.
Oh wait, so you're literally hugging the trees?
I literally hug trees. Yeah, but I can't post that on Instagram because, first of all, I don't do a lot of social media, and also, how do you do a selfie when your arms are wrapped around the old oak or whatever it is?
Yeah, that is a challenge.
Maybe you do the one-handed, with the other, or get a selfie stick.
I'll have to practice that.
Right. And you're a word witch.
I am a word witch.
What is that?
That's not an original term. That one of my favorite writers, Kat Howard, uses that term, and I know other people who do too. So think Glinda with a notebook and pen.
Okay.
So I happen to believe, in terms of what we have as instruments, as creatures, language is way up there in terms of magical powers. I mean, I'm fascinated by language. I'm fascinated by how language can touch the body, the somatics of language. I'm fascinated by how language can make us feel. And so that's always been a part of my life. And I think the word witch is fun and has elasticity to it, and so that's just something I like to call myself.
Well, that's my new learn something of the day for me.
Yeah, we could be word witches, or at least
I
a
think
Wicca.
you both already are.
Yeah. We spend a lot of time with words, yes.
Yeah, a lot.
Yes. So I've referred to your Moxie as intentional, Moxie, and I'm going to tell you how I think of you, because, well, first I want to ask you, do you think you have Moxie?
I don't, in that what I perceive as Moxie, and I realize this is very superficial, is people putting out their brand actively through social media channels or whatnot. And I don't do that for so many reasons, and maybe I should, and I'm a little shy, and I don't really do it, and so I don't consider myself one of those people. I also, it's like the Woody Allen quote, I could never hurt anybody, I was beat up by Quakers. I think he actually said that, which is hilarious. I mean, coming from a Quaker background, I tend to be a little quieter. So if I have Moxie, it's a meek Moxie. How's that?
We're fine with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's your definition. It's your feeling of it. So, just curious to see how you felt about it. If you had it or you thought you had it or not.
I wouldn't have thought it, but if you would like to put it on me, that's lovely.
Yeah.
I will take it.
And I was telling Thor, the reason I feel that you have Moxie is I've been going to your yoga class almost since you opened your studio. Maybe you didn't know me then as much, but I would go back when we had a house in Sharon, and I would come up when I could, and your teaching has that combination of spiritual, an awakening consciousness with the body that not every yoga teacher can accomplish. And in the article that we wrote together for Main Street, you talked about it being this whole practice, that it's not a modality, it's really a way of looking at the world. And I always admire that you have never sold out to something else, and that you have a lot of integrity in how you run your practice and how you just interact with your clients, if I can call them that, people who come to your class. And so I just feel that your ability to walk the walk of yoga philosophy and life is amazing. And I've often told you, or I've told you at least once, that I would love to make a Sarah bobblehead for my dashboard, because every time I walk into a room with you, my blood pressure just goes down just because you're standing there.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I think the bobblehead thing, we need to run with this.
That's merch.
This is how we're going to make our millions. That's very kind of you. I do think, I love and appreciate yoga, what I understand of it and what it's done for me. And I do enjoy sharing it with other people. So I really appreciate your saying that.
Well, I think you've changed lives. I mean, you have women of all ages who have gone through illness and relationships and life struggles, and I feel like your yoga is part of their bedrock. So I don't know if you get that.
Thank you. And I also will interject that when I was diagnosed with cancer in early 2020, and I all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, realized the full potential of my yoga practice to support me. I think it's really when the going gets tough that if we have had a practice, whatever that is, we all of a sudden realize its power. It's not just for the easy times, it's for the complicated times. And I do also feel that yoga has taught me how to rest. And in this world, I know both of you have experienced splintered, fragmented attention, which is such a part of our lives right now. We're pulled in so many different directions. And it literally does affect our brains in a way that isn't healthy. And I do feel that yoga helps us reintegrate and find a sense of union again. And that's very powerful.
Is it just that connection with your own body, your soul?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just being, what is real and true in the present moment, that definition of mindfulness, feeling what is without judgment, just being able to touch that is very important these days. Somatic self-care, I think, is more important than ever.
So if you had some advice for our listeners, what would you suggest?
I'm climbing up on my soapbox, and
my yoga box.
And I really, this is very important. I really believe that anybody who has a creative product needs to decide what will happen with that material when they die. Okay. And you need to deal with this now, not when your first gray hair sprouts out of your head, not when you get the frightening diagnosis. It needs to be dealt with not just for the sake of your heirs, but for the sake of the art. And my dad, I'll tell you two little stories. I hope we have time.
We do.
One is that I had just moved to California, and my dad arranged to have a meeting with his lawyer and me over the future of his artwork. Hundreds of paintings, thousands of drawings. And he died before that meeting could take place, unexpectedly. That's one story. Here's another story, and this is true. And I'm an artist in the Berkshire area who had success as an illustrator, passed away. This was years and years ago. And I think had 3 or 4 children. And the children disagreed about what to do with the work. And they had a rather strong disagreement to the point which the artist's house, which contained this person's studio, was closed up and untouched for over 20 years. Wow. And you know what happens with houses in this area. Mice moved in, squirrels, raccoons. Much of the art was damaged until fairly recently there was a renewed interest in this person's art, and the house was opened and much of the art was saved. So I'm saying that because I think a lot of painters, poets, people who knit their crochet tea, cozies, whatever it is, think that their heirs will just sort of know what to do and will care about the art as much as they do. It's very hard to look your own mortality in the face. I realize that, but I beg any artistic person who's listening, you must figure this out, because there are amazing gifts that came to me because my dad was an artist, but it also has taken an enormous amount of time and energy and resources to figure out what to do with his work.
Right.
And it's kind of like a moral question. What are my responsibilities to his body of work? It's very challenging.
So you're the keeper of his legacy.
I'm the keeper of his legacy, simultaneously wanting to pursue my own interests, which is a really hard thing to juggle, especially as a woman in this world. So that's one of the soapboxes I have, is that people, get your wills together, decide what's going to happen to your paintings. Don't assume that your kids are all going to get along and be in agreement, because when a parental figure passes away, family dynamics change in unexpected ways.
And sometimes dramatically.
And it can be heartbreaking. So I really do believe in the legal preparations.
That's great advice.
I feel very strongly about it.
Yeah, and you're living it.
I am living it.
And have you turned a corner with that, or it's just a continued...
I feel, so it took me years. I mean, my dad's death was, it wasn't just a lot to integrate because he was a parent, but I did sort of have to back up my life and come back to this area when I had just moved out west. Right. I felt responsible for cataloging the work and trying to get exhibits together, which I did. I was pushed a little bit by certain people to perhaps try to sell it all. Now, my dad's work has never been particularly valuable, and there's some things that were never actually had sales records, but I just couldn't do that. And I think that maybe that's partly my personality. I was holding on to him a little bit through holding on to this body of work, but I also was cautious, and for good or ill, I'm not sure, what time will tell, but I'm a little more confident these days of trying to get exhibits. Like we had some wonderful ones, like at the Movie House under the Sadlons and at the Hotchkiss Library in Sharon. Little things happen bit by bit.
And what about any yoga practices that could encourage Moxie?
Yeah, I think a really healthy thing to do is let go of your ideas of what yoga has to be. And I would also say to artistic people, let go of your ideas of what an artistic creation has to be, and play, and go for what feels healthy and nourishing for you, and also sparks your curiosity and sparks your compassion to yourself and the people around you. I think we're living in a time where we're looking at old definitions. Yoga is particularly troublesome. There's some issues with cultural co-option, which I am very, very conscious of in my own work. But where the old ways and the old definitions don't really work anymore for what we're faced with. We have to be more resilient. We have to think differently. Maybe we can't practice for 90 minutes anymore. Maybe we can do 10 minutes. Little bits count. And I'm saying this both about somatic self-care and also about creative endeavors. Little bits count, and it's like taking little sips of water throughout the day. There's a nourishment in that I think is often overlooked.
Well, I think that also helps someone incorporate it into their life instead of this on the mat, off the mat. That if you're doing it a minute a day when you're standing in line at the coffee shop or dealing with your kids or whatever it is, that you can bring yourself to an awareness of the moment, in the moment, and not have to wait for that time yoga class at 4:30.
Absolutely. It was never meant to be something you drove 15 minutes and went into a building to do. It was meant to be something that wove through your entire life, like creativity wove through my father's life. And I think that we are in a place where we can get back to that now, because so many people's quote-unquote regular lives were utterly shattered by the pandemic, and everyone had to rethink not only how they spent their time, but what was really important to them.
For sure.
True.
Can I ask, how do you define your brand of yoga?
Oh, gee.
Because you referenced there's, the different perspectives on it. There's been a big change in yoga. So I was just curious how you define your own brand.
Yeah, and that's a work in progress. I'll be open and
everything
saying,
changes. So,
I mean, my main influence in the last literally 20 years has been the work of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, who developed body-mind centering as filtered through my primary teacher, Patty Townsend, who was with Yoga Center Amherst. And BMC, Body Mind Centering, looks at the way we as creatures develop both in utero and as toddlers, and how we learn about movement and being in the world. It also looks at evolutionary development, how cells form, what cells are. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. And then my teacher took that and applied it to classical yoga in a way that really excited me. So that's definitely a huge influence. But I'm really influenced just by the practicalities of people spending all days hunched over their phone or staring at horrible images on a television screen, or, what challenges do we have right now, and what would soothe and what would stabilize, and also what would spark joy so people can continue. And I feel for that I have to go a little bit outside of embodied anatomy and things like that, and look to the world and what's yummy, what's tasty, what can get people talking to each other, talking to themselves, having conversations, being kind. I don't have answers to any of these things, but these are things I hold when I think about yoga and teaching.
So it's connection and joy.
Connection and joy.
And yummy.
That's a t-shirt.
Yummy. Unsweetened
Get your
chocolate.
yummy on.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you both so much. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm delighted that you're doing this podcast, and you guys are both magnificent people, and I'm really... I'm serious.
We have more time for that kind of stuff.
I'm really excited for you, but thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you for coming. Mary, I think that this was such a fun episode, such a fun interview, and I love the crossover.
Yes. To quote Sarah, it was yummy.
I think she needs to make some t-shirts.
Yes. Yummy yoga.
Oh, alliteration.
Yeah.
And this episode is full of alliterations, too.
It was. And I love that we were able to go intergenerational with Moxie.
Love that.
Because this started out as a Moxie by Proxy episode about her dad, and then we segued pretty naturally into her life of Moxie. And there's a quote that was in, which we didn't cover in the interview, but that was in The New Yorker. It was a tribute to Arthur Getz after his death, written by Lee Lorenz, and that was back in 1996. And it said, "Arthur was not vain, but he never undervalued his own work." And I really feel that's an important statement, and I didn't know Arthur Getz, obviously, but I feel that exemplifies Sarah. She's playful and fun, and yet she really values the work that she does and is very intentional about it. She has an intentional Moxie.
And I think both of them are very dedicated to their lives, careers, and just the whole aspect of everything that revolves around, and not just their work. And I thought that for me, at least for her dad, learning about him through her, one of my takeaways was his kind of dedication to his path in life, and just a little story of how he had to have his art teacher come to his house to talk to his parents into letting him go to art school. And to me, that just showed, not just his Moxie, not that we were overusing that word, but just his connection with his artistry, and that he knew that was his life, and, the ups and downs of it in his career, and how that impacted his entire life.
Yeah, and also this tension between pragmatism and putting food on the table and cultivating a creative life. And I felt like I could relate to his form of creativity because it was very, as the French say, quotidien. It was very everyday. He'd be in a supermarket and finding inspiration in these mundane, seemingly mundane moments, but that moments we all live through and can identify with. And I really appreciated that.
Well, it's just looking at life a little different. And I think, Sarah also does that in her life and how she views it. And I think a lot of it probably came from her dad and her mom, these artistic types, and, how their brain works.
Yes.
And how you approach life.
Yes, and I liked what she said about what was instilled in her at a young age, that a life of creativity can be foundational for how one builds a life. And she has really lived that. And she's another one who didn't think she had Moxie, but we told her differently, didn't we?
We showed her.
Yeah, we did. Anyway, I think that was another great episode. So till next time.
And if you need any more info, check our show notes.
This episode of Main Street Moxie is proudly sponsored by Northeast Ford and Elise Harney Real Estate.